Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to introduce Daphne Miller, who is a practicing physician in San Francisco and who today will be discussing her new book, The Jungle Effect. In researching this book, Dr. Miller traveled around the world to various cold spots, which are areas with low incidence of certain diseases. And in these areas, she researched the local diets to see what kinds of health benefits the foods might impart, and then how we can take advantage of these foods in our own diets. Well, she can explain this much better than I can, so I'll let her talk. But after she's done, we'll be taking questions over at that microphone, so you guys can line up there. And after that, she'll be signing books over at that table. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, great. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and it's actually very funny for me to come down to Google because I have a lot of patients who are Google employees. I see some of you in the audience actually right now. And you all tend to be very healthy. I think there's a good chef down here or something who's keeping you well. So I don't even know if I have that much to teach you today. But normally as a physician, I see people make dramatic changes in the way that they live for two reasons. One is because they get a horrible, frightening diagnosis that really blows them out of the water, or someone they love gets a horrible diagnosis, and that motivates them to change. And the second reason is because they hear a wonderful story that's told to them just right and that really resonates with them and makes sense and makes them want to go down a different path. And that's what I'm hoping that the Jungle Effect gives you, and also that my talk gives you today. We're actually going to go on a little travel adventure in the next 45 minutes, and I hope at the end you feel like you've had a little bit of a story. So the story starts in my office in San Francisco with a patient who comes in and tells me, this is someone at this point who's already in her late 30s, early 40s, comes in and is dealing with a number of issues. She's dealing with weight. She's dealing with the fact that her blood pressure is going up. She's dealing with the fact that her blood sugar is starting to rise. But she tells me an amazing story. She tells me that every time that she goes back to her native area in Brazil, and it happens that part of her family is from the jungle, from the rainforest, she feels better. Her weight goes down. Her knees feel better, her mood improves, everything improves. And what's bizarre to her is she actually feels like she's eating more and maybe even exercising a little bit less. But all these transformations are happening in her body. So of course, as a doctor who's reasonably intelligent, I write it off to the fact that she's on vacation. She's relaxed. Everything's better when you're relaxed, right? So luck will have it, about 6 months after I first met this patient, guess who ended up in the jungle herself? About 2 days slow boat ride upstream from where this patient's village was located. Me. I took you guys know how cold San Francisco is in the summer. I took a volunteer job down there. I asked my partner to mind the practice. I went down with my husband, my kids, and I was working in this little remote village in the middle of nowhere, up a tributary of the Amazon River. Really nothing other than a local sugarcane press to make wine. That was probably the only industry in the village, and everything that they ate came from the river or from the jungle itself. This was the tiny little clinic. I worked in there. And what was fascinating to me is the local Indian population that came to this clinic. Here's some of the examples of the hale and hearty patients I would see. They had piranha bites. They had machete wounds. They even had the occasional amazing case of tetanus. I saw some malaria. But even amongst the very elderly, I never saw the high blood pressure, the diabetes, the depression, the heart disease, all the things that plague us, cancers, that are my bread and butter in San Francisco. Now, trying to tease out what it was that caused this. I mean, wearing monkeys on your head is apparently very, very good for your health, I soon learned, as they would sort of jump from the trees and, a relatively happy lifestyle. Was it the fact that you had to push these very heavy dugout canoes around if you wanted to get anywhere? Certainly there was more physical exercise. But what was most striking was the diet. everything that these folks were eating came directly from the jungle, from the river, from the free-range chickens and animals that lived there. And not only that, it was a diet that had been developed over hundreds to thousands of years because it worked well in their bodies, in the bodies of the local people who lived there. The recipes made sense, the spices, the ingredients, the progression in the day. It was really a whole diet that was keeping them healthy. And that was something that was so fascinating to me and certainly explained a lot of what was going on for my patient when she would go back to her village. So if there's the jungle effect, which I'm calling this benefit of receiving these indigenous diets, then the opposite of that is the migration effect. And that jungle effect is a term that was invented by me. Migration effect happens to be a very established term that sociologists and anthropologists have used for a long time. Now, the migration effect is what happens to you when you leave your native land and go to some place that is more westernized and modernized and McDonaldized, and what happens to your body. Certainly, this is a living example of it right here. These are Indians who live in their native village in Gujarat over on the left, and this is their BMI, which is a way of measuring overall body mass. See what happens to their brothers once they move to England, okay? These are two graphs. These are not different generations. It's been controlled for smoking, for marital status, for a lot of different things. And you see that within the same generation, there's a huge shift in body mass just from having left the rural areas. Now, migration effect does not just happen when people leave their native shores and come here. We've become very, very good at exporting it, so you don't even have to have moved more than 10 feet in the past 10,000 years, and you are affected by it at this point. This is Okinawa in Japan, famous site for longevity. It's, there's the Okinawa diet and so on. Well, now there's a McDonald's on every corner. And when Don Fujita brought McDonald's to Japan, he told the Japanese, look, if you eat this wonderful food, you will grow to be tall and beautiful like Americans. Well, they did grow, but it wasn't quite in the direction that he promised. So, and this is our eau de high fructose corn syrup. Here's the Medina in Fez, where you can't even get a car or even your own body up through these tiny little alleyways, but they figured out a way to get Coca-Cola on a mule. So, and a final example of the migration effect, so sad. This is the back of a cereal box that's being sold in Japan by Kellogg's. Anybody who can read Japanese can translate this for me effectively. But it's basically saying, eat this. I don't know if I can get my pointer to work. Eat this, not that, okay? Well, basically that, minus the white rice, is what's been eaten traditionally for thousands of years and is another one of those diets that makes sense for breakfast, that's been developed slowly. But no, they're bringing in the bran and telling you this is actually much better for you, and that's really the message that's given all over the world. So it's gotten to such a sad place where you ask the average American kid to fantasize in their head, where do you get the most delicious tortilla or burrito? Do they picture this or do they picture that? And that's really where we've come. And actually, folks, we are in an amazing spot right now in the history of the world. If you look just around 2008, maybe it happened like a year or two ago. Do you see what happened? Can anybody tell from that graph what happened for the very first time? You guys are all good with numbers. What happened in that intersection there? All of a sudden, stroke and heart disease and all those things have become the leading cause of death and have surpassed infectious disease. You see that line? Right there, okay, is pretty much where it's happened. It's kind of off the graph, but it's pretty amazing. We are now globally suffering much more from overconsumption than underconsumption. And I just spent last summer as a visiting professor in Japan at the medical school, and look how young this team is. There's one guy with gray hair on the team, and he was just there for decorum. I mean, metabolic syndrome, which is what happens, this whole thing of diabetes and hypertension, it's a new phenomenon. They're trying to figure out how to deal with it. And it's just young doctors that are really starting to get involved in this because the old guys don't know how to deal with this. So these issues really, in my experience with the jungle effect in Peru, are what catapulted me around the world, trying to find places where the indigenous diet is still alive and well, and where I could bring home tidbits of information that would really help us to preserve these secrets and to change our own diets. And I picked 5 specific spots that still have overall longevity, but also have really low rates of one specific chronic disease. And if it's all right with you, what I'm going to do is just bring you through a little bit of a sampling, a little tasting menu of the different places I went. And you guys are a quiet crowd, I think. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But if you have questions or something seems compelling, or you want to tell me about your great Aunt Minnie as I'm going along, please do, okay? Because that's really what this should be about. So first spot we're going to go to is only, I don't know, maybe 300 miles as the crow flies south of Tucson. But honestly, it was the most remote spot that I went to. It was Copper Canyon in Mexico. Any mountain bikers here who've gone down there? Anybody been down there? You guys, this is so close. It's bigger than the Grand Canyon. It's so amazing. So I had to, let's see, what did I do? I flew to El Paso. I walked across the border. I took a taxi to Juarez. I took a bus that was decent and might have even had air conditioning to Chihuahua. And then I took a school bus up through the mountains to Crete. And then I rode on the most rickety thing I've ever been on down these hair-raising turns for about 6 hours to where the Tarahumara Indians live. And I actually brought my kids with me. I'm such a bad mom. But why did I go to this place? Well, you can see here that the Tarahumara, or the Mexican Pima, do they have houses like this down here on the Google campus? I mean, they have everything else. Maybe you guys have something. But it's not how we folks in San Francisco live, okay? It's pretty different. And yet, a lot of this is by choice. The Mexican government's been like, we'll give you some fancy tin homes or whatever. They say, no, you take your modernity. You know what you can do with that modernity. We want to live like this in our remote rancheros, and we want to preserve all our traditions. And they've really had to fight to do it. Now, look what you get as a result of this. They are blood relatives to the U.S. Pima. And has anybody heard about the U.S. Pima? Well, they are unfortunately poster children for diabetes, okay? Were one of the healthiest Native American tribes ever until about, the Industrial Revolution, when they started to get exposed to all of our processed foods. And now, by the time you are in your 20s, as a Pima Indian, you have a 40% chance of developing diabetes. Whereas the Mexican Pima, or Tarahumara, this is an artificially high number because it samples Tarahumarans who have also moved to the city. If you truly live a traditional Tarahumaran life, there is practically no diabetes. So can you say that genes are a factor? Not a big one, right? So that's really fascinating. So what do the Tarahumarans eat? Guess what? They eat a ton of carbohydrates. For all you carbophobics out there, oh my God, carbs are so bad for you, right? Well, it's so fascinating. It turns out when you don't eat the white rice, and when you don't eat the processed pasta, and when you don't eat the breads, and by the way, even whole wheat is a very processed grain, in case you were curious, but when you eat the real indigenous carbohydrates as they come from the earth, and that includes corn that would not win any awards at your local 4-H fair, okay? It's like these little gnarly ears of corn where every single kernel is misshapen, and you make your tortillas out of it. It's called masa quebrada because it's like has still chunks of the corn in it, and it's delicious and nutty. So they eat a lot of corn and squash and beans. They call it the three sisters, or the tres hermanas. And it turns out when you make these amazing tortillas, which I've learned how to make and have become addicted to, and you eat them with the beans and a great bean stew, and the book has a lot of recipes. You guys can make all this stuff. the glycemic index, the release of sugar from the corn, actually comes down to match that of the beans. So there's this whole magical interaction that happens. Now, the most amazing thing I realized when I was down there with traveling around and visiting the Tarahumara was this. Does anybody know what that is? Cactus. And anybody know one of the medicinal properties of cactus? Take a wild guess. It lowers blood sugar. It actually has some of the same things in it as metformin, which is a diabetes medication. And then I met this guy named Taurino, who was half Tarahumaran and half, he calls himself mestizo. But he was a gardener and a cook, and he was like my ambassador, because it's not like the Tarahumarans are exactly like, welcome, come into my home. They're trying to keep people like me away. So Taurino showed me his garden. I spent a day in his garden. It turns out that all these foods, jicama, cilantro, cinnamon, and the nopales, and more than 300 varieties of food down there are anti-diabetic, okay? So turns out, not only are the Tarahumarans, eating these low glycemic foods, they're actually surrounded by an anti-diabetic garden. And it just made me wonder, could that explain a little bit this Latino paradox that people are talking about, that they come to this country and get sicker than everybody else? Maybe it's because not only are they eating our horrible processed foods, but they actually have lost all their magical protective foods all in one generation. And for me, it was just really amazing to realize how these indigenous diets are set up to heal us and cure us. So one other thing I noticed when I was down there was that this is as close as you get to a piece of processing equipment. If you were to take some corn and try and make some corn oil from this, anybody think they could? I challenge you. You get tendinitis, right? That's about it. But if you were to take an olive and put it in there, you think you might get something greasy out of it or come close? Yeah. So what an interesting way of thinking about oils, indigenous versus processed oils. And it turns out, that's my little corn, when you compare indigenous oils, and there's palm fruit oil is another one and so on, versus processed oils, the big difference, everybody's all hopped up about saturated fats, but look at where the big difference is between these two oils. Can anybody take a guess from looking at these? Omega-6 fats, okay? Just put that in your cap. It's this fascinating thing. People are always talking about healing fats and unhealing fats. I refuse to enter the debate. But it seems to me like we should be focusing more on these unhealthy omega-6 fats that are really found in a lot of the processed oils where you need heavy equipment and lots of acetone to make them. So,
go back, I'm sorry, one slide.
Sure.
What would you classify as indigenous oils besides the...
Well, I'm wondering if it's oils that you can make on your metate or your grindstone. This is me bringing back my lessons to you, okay?
And you have lard up there.
Yeah, well, they use a lot of lard, and it's delicious, and it actually is rich in omega-3 fats if it's a free-range pig. We'll get into it more in a couple seconds. But the other thing about the Tarahumara is they do walk. Apparently, those who walk well means Tarahumara. So we have to remember that as well. But nothing that we couldn't accomplish in an hour of walking around this campus every day. So next spot that I went to, here we go, was a place that's been covered a lot in terms of nutrition literature. And that is the island of Crete. But I personally went to Crete to figure out what was the magical ingredient that was keeping them from getting heart disease. Okay, they have these incredibly low rates of heart disease. This was a 25-year study called the 7-country study where they compared men to Crete on a bunch of places, including Minneapolis, but a bunch of other places in Europe. And the people on Crete fared way better than everywhere else. So what were they doing just well on the island of Crete? Well, first I met Yorgos, who owns the Biolea olive farm in Astrikas. I mean, they sell to Whole Foods and William and Sonoma. It's this organic olive farm. And he said, it's the olive oil. You have to know that the olive oil is the cause of our longevity. We press it with these big ancient stones. I went over and looked at Yorgos' screensaver on his computer, and there were his grandparents, okay, who had each lived to past 100, and he told me they drank 50 kilos of olive oil between the two of them each day. And then I met Katerinas, who lives in Milatos, which is a little town on the coast. And she said, it might be the olive oil, but it's really the horta, or the wild greens. And you cook the olive oil in them, and it brings the nutrients out. And she brought me horta picking. And we went out with our little knives and picked these little wild dandelion that taste fantastic when they're cooked in olive oil. You notice that her bag is twice as full as mine. And they fed most of mine to the chickens. I didn't do a very good job at that. But then I met Stelios, and he runs this natural food store in Hanya. And he said, it might be the olive oil, it might be the horta, but it's certainly the grains, the whole grains. We here on Crete know how to eat a whole grain bread. And he gave me this bread to eat, this rusk or paksamati, and I wish that I'd had my molars redone before I came to the island, because it was, really incredibly hard to chew in. And then I met Iona, who is the grandmother of Katerina. And by the way, some of these folks, I mean, they're healthy, they're in their 90s, but they don't look like Natalie Portman, okay? They have some meat on their bones, and that was an interesting thing for me to see too. We have a very much of a stereotype here of what is healthy and what isn't. So this is Iona, who's in her late 80s, and she said it's the fish. Here she had her fish and some barley flour and was about to cook it in olive oil, and she also made me this amazing octopus. And then I met this guy, Nikos, who said, it's none of that. It's the raki. It's this eau de vie made from grape must. You drink 2 bottles of that a day, and you will be just fine. And I listened to him and actually nearly fell on the old cobblestone pavements of Crete. So I wasn't so sure about his advice. So then I went back to the medical literature, which is what any decent scientist will do. And Antonia Tricopoulou is a researcher who's been studying this stuff on Crete for years. And she, too, has been trying to find that magical ingredient that is involved in longevity and preventing heart disease. So she took all these Cretan foods and gave them each points. And her hypothesis was, well, the meat and the sweets and the starchy foods are going to be, they're going to have an increased hazard ratio for death, meaning they're going to be more likely to kill you. And the vegetables and the fruits are going to have a decreased hazard ratio for death. And then she did all this work on her computer, and to her shock, everything was about 1, which is non-contributory. Nothing deviated terribly and dramatically from that number. So how fascinating. The foods she thought were going to be terrible weren't so horrible. The foods she thought were going to be great weren't so great. What's the answer? Anybody know? You're a chef. What's the answer? What? It's the mixing, once again. It's this amazing food synergy that happens. Like, it's so incredible that we cannot reproduce this. We cannot say it's the beta-carotene or the carrots or the olive oil. We always want to reduce things, right? It's the way these ingredients have been put together for hundreds to thousands of years, the way the olive oil probably brings out things like lycopene in the tomatoes and the horta and the lemon and the garlic work together with the greens and the fish. And wow, so we might just have to follow recipes. And my last lesson on Crete was from this guy, Nectarios. I arrived there at the end of Lent. And Cretans have these modified, I put fast days, that's wrong, modified fast days, where they give up things like sweets and red meat and so on. And they do it for about 180 days a year, staggered in 40-day segments. They still eat fabulously. I was there during a fast, and it was amazing. But what was so incredible to me was that the studies show that folks like Nectarios, even when they're not in a fast period, their cholesterol is better and everything else is better. So, and the final lesson I learned on Crete was, as I was sitting there and gulping down my food, I bet a lot of you guys eat fast here because you have to get from one meeting to another. The owner of the restaurant came up and said to me, "Siga, siga," which means slow, slow. And that was a very valuable lesson, and that's how folks live there. So next spot was Iceland. And the reason I went to Iceland, okay, was because, well, it's a cold, dark place. Half the year, they don't even have any sunlight at all. Viking mayhem. It's a place of tales of Viking mayhem. My husband's sort of falling down a waterfall there in the corner. But the reason I went there was because it turns out that despite all of these things, Icelanders have these surprisingly low rates of depression and seasonal affective disorder, which is like winter blues. They also happen to have lower rates of bipolar disorder and a bunch of other depression-associated disorders. And these are things that have been studied with culturally appropriate questionnaires, because people always ask me about that. And these are just a bunch of the studies on depression. I kind of put them all on one slide. So I went there to try and figure out why. And first thing I do whenever I come to a new cold spot is first I go to the supermarket and see what's there. I'm sure you guys all do that whenever you arrive somewhere new, right? And then the next place I go is the cemetery, okay? And it turns out that they weren't lying about Iceland. I mean, those Icelanders lived to 100. All I had to do was go down one plot line to take these pictures, okay? It's like everybody lives to over 100 there. It's so crazy. And so I met with this researcher, Johan Axelsson, and his wife, Ingur Axelsson, and he's been trying to study this depression paradox there. Why northernmost, so cold, so dark, and yet so little depression? And by the way, this picture was taken at 11 o'clock at night in the summer. So, they get a lot of sunshine in the summer. So the obvious question was, it's the fishker, okay? Icelanders eat about 245 pounds of fish per person per year. I think we're like at 45 or something. So even way more than Japanese, who are a distant second. And as you all know, because I know you're very nutrition savvy, fish is filled with omega-3 fats. And omega-3 fats are healthy for the brain and probably are part of the explanation. And as a matter of fact, this is Joseph Hilbaum's work. He works at National Institute of Health. And this is a map that graphs rates of bipolar disorder and rates of fish consumption. And you can see that they're inversely proportional. So very interesting. All this stuff seems to add up. But there was a problem with this theory. And that was that Johan Axelsson told me that the groups that he was studying mainly lived inland in Iceland in an area called Egilsstaðir. And for every one fish meal, they were having like 7 sheep meals. And it didn't make sense, and he was very troubled by this. So what would you do if you were troubled by this question about where the Icelanders were getting their omega-3s? You would what?
Look at the oil that they're...
Oh, well, actually, he decided to go look at the sheep. So he went and he killed a sheep. I'm sorry for you animal rights activists. And he measured the omega-3 levels in the sheep. And sure enough, they were almost as high as they were in the fish. And then he said, well, how could that be? Maybe they're eating fish. Turns out they weren't eating fish. No fish were being eaten by those sheep. They were eating this moss, this little free-range fresh moss that grows in Iceland that is filled with an omega-3 precursor called alpha-linolenic acid. And it turns out that when you eat your free-range or pasture-fed animals, even here in the States, you are getting more omega-3 fats than your grain-fed, hormone-filled, corn-fed, pen-kept, grain-fed beef. That is, what you're all trying to avoid these days. So there's other ways to get these omega-3 fats. And then I visited the dairies with the free-range cows, and it turns out that the milk is filled with omega-3 fats. Here's a happy Icelandic family drinking. See that big pitcher of milk that they just finished, the way we would, like a Pepsi Cola, thing of Pepsi Cola or something. And then I had my biggest shock of all in Iceland, one that to this day just astounds me. Those Icelanders, they are vegetable haters, okay? When I would ask them about vegetables, they would say, those are not food. I don't eat those. And then I visited the Icelandic greenhouses that are geothermically heated, and where like 1/3 of all the vegetables on the island are grown for this population of 350,000 people. And I tasted one of their tomatoes in mid-July, and I just spat it out. It was disgusting. It was hard as a rock, and the cucumbers tasted like toilet paper rolls. And I understood why they hated vegetables. But it didn't make sense because these low rates of depression, and you need things like B12 and folic acid and vitamin C in order to keep your brain healthy, right? That's what I've learned in my nutrition courses. Well, it turns out that they're getting them, but they're getting them in unorthodox ways. They're getting them from cabbage and little new potatoes, and they actually use the Icelandic moss in with the barley, that same moss that's keeping the cows and the sheep healthy. And they eat bilberries or blueberries in summer, fresh picked, and then they freeze them for winters. So you can get all these nutrients without being a big leafy salad eater, it turns out. I know that's very, that's heresy, but you don't have to go to the big leafy salad bar in order to get these. So next spot, as we go around the globe, is Cameroon in West Africa. And Cameroon, why did I go there? Well, I went there precisely for this reason. Once again, a genetic issue being ruled out. West Africans have some of the lowest rates of colon cancer in the world, and African Americans have some of the highest, who presumably can trace some of their ancestry back. So I was fascinated because colon cancer, this is not just an issue for African Americans, this is an issue for all of us. It's the fastest growing cancer here in the US, and it's something we all want to figure out how to prevent. So I discovered the 5 F's in Cameroon. The first one obviously is fiber, and we talk about that a lot. And here, this is a typical dish there. It's called ndole. It's delicious. I know it looks like a pile of yucky mush, but I have a recipe for it in the book, and it's fantastic. And it's got ground nuts in it and fish and a little tiny bit of beef, but you can substitute tofu if you want. And then it has tons of wild greens in it. It's just a wonderful flavor. So fiber is a big issue. But the second F, this idea of less flesh, okay? So here, meat is the center of the plate, and everything else is crowded around on the periphery. And yet, there, meat is treated as a spice, as something wonderful and special that you use, but that flavors up the whole meal. And obviously, the animals, you can see, they're just so happy. They're free range, for sure. When you do eat your animal, what it has eaten has been very healthy. And that makes a big difference, too. And you can just see in sheer quantity. In the village that I was in West Africa, you kill your steer, it's a big occasion. You do it because your daughter's getting married or some other fabulous thing is happening. Otherwise, it's like killing your bank account, Versus for us, look at that, $1.79 a pound for that junk, okay? That's way too cheap, our meat, okay? And it ends up being that we eat too much of it. But here was the third F that I discovered in West Africa that really was fascinating to me. These are all different kinds of fermented foods, fermented millet, fermented corn, fermented manioc that are eaten. This is a beer, a fermented beer right there. They all have different fascinating names to them. And it turns out that all these fermented foods have all these bacteria in them. Anybody read your local yogurt container of all the bacteria in your yogurt that are supposed to be good? Do any of those look familiar to you? Yeah, like lactobacillus. Yeah, these are all happy, good bacteria that you want to populate your gut. And it turns out that it's not just West Africa. All of the cultures that I visited use a lot of fermented foods in their diet. And it turns out that fermented foods not only help with your immune system and help with allergy prevention, but they also help rebuild the lining of your gut. And there's been some very interesting, groundbreaking studies showing that people that eat more of these foods make fewer colon polyps, which are the precursor to colon cancer. So, another interesting finding. Foraged greens were another thing that was very much part of the West African diet. This is a fancy little biochemistry graph for any of you who were pre-med and then veered off towards computer science. You'll remember but the simple explanation is that folate, which is available in these greens, actually blocks the reproduction of bad DNA, so cancer replicating DNA, and might play a strong role. And finally, healthy fats, as in this palm fruit oil and olive oil, might play an important role in colon cancer prevention. So the final cold spot was Okinawa, and I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that I ended up there as a visiting professor. And this was this crazy sculpture that was in one of the gardens there. Anybody been to Okinawa? Anybody been to any of the spots I've been to? Where have you been? Copper Canyon. Oh, so you have been to Copper Canyon. Oh, you came in late, because I asked for a show of hands. Okay, wonderful. We have one Copper Canyon Voyager here. So did you go down into the canyons? Oh, wonderful. Yeah, a true Copper Canyon Voyager, not the one who took the little train along the top and ate very non-indigenous foods. But so Okinawa in Japan, another very famous longevity spot. There's books written about it. National Geographic did a big piece. This guy just wrote the Blue Zone, or a Blue Zone TV show. I don't know how many of you saw that. It included Okinawa. But I was fascinated by Okinawa because they have these incredibly low rates of breast and prostate cancer. And I wanted to figure out why. Two cancers that really plague us here in the US. And interestingly enough, when Okinawans come to the United States, within one generation, their rates start to match ours. So once again, genes are not a big factor. So these are all fabulous Okinawan foods that seem to play a role in protecting glandular health. And by the way, why do I lump breast and prostate cancer together? Because in a way, the breast is to women what the prostate is to men. They are analogous glands in many ways, and when you have hyperplasia in one or the other, they actually are very similar in the way they act, and it's becoming more and more obvious that they really are twin glands. So you can feel very connected across genders that way. But green tea has a lot of anti-cancer properties in it, the polyphenols and the tannins in the green tea. That was one explanation. These bitter melon, or the Goya, which are kind of similar to different bitter melon fruits that you can get in Chinatown here, or even our melons, the lycopene on at the base of the melon, the more bitter part of like watermelon that you eat has this property. So eat the bitter part, the rind of your watermelon. So these are considered to have very strong anti-cancer anti-cancer properties as well. The genmai, or the brown rice, has some properties in it, and the fish, and the seaweed, the iodine in the seaweed is thought to have strong cancer protection. But then I came across this. I walked into Makishi Public Market, which is one of the biggest markets in downtown, in the main city there, and there was row upon row of pig products. And I was like, my goodness, how do I reconcile this with this diet of great longevity and low cancer risk? I mean, after all, aren't we taught that pig is kind of bad for you? Well, once again, it's what your pig eats matters, and also a matter of quantity. The way, yeah, sure, they sell, first of all, they eat the whole pig, my God. They venerate the pig. It's pig ears, pig hooves, pig intestines. And by the way, it turns out in all animals, who here eats offal? O-F-F-A-L. You should be very proud of that. You should raise your hand higher. You are a whole animal eater. And that's really important, okay? Not only environmentally, but also if you're eating organic, which I assume you are if you're brave enough to eat offal, then you're actually getting the most nutritious parts of the animal. We all get distracted by those loins and the, things like now everybody's into pork belly. But it's really the ears and the liver and the kidneys that have all the good stuff. Stay away from the brains, unless, but they do sell brains there. But so
concerns about liver, about toxicity in livers now. I mean, I used to eat a lot more, but when I was
if you eat junk liver, you're going to get junk food. If you eat an animal that's eaten fabulous stuff, you're going to get good food. So it really is a matter of what your meat eats matters, right? So, but better to invest in little bits of high-quality meat and really eat the whole animal. And there's a lot of chefs in San Francisco that are doing this up now with tip-to-tail, cooking. But the Okinawans, that's how they do it. And when they cook their meat, this is Fujiko-san, who is a wonderful woman who taught me a lot of my cooking on the island. She was the mother of a doctor colleague of mine, Kenji, and I spent hours in her kitchen. And she used pork. You see there in the background, she has a couple bottles of Wesson oil. I had to disclose that, but she really rarely uses it. And she was just a fabulous cook, and she showed me how you use little bits of meat and piles of vegetables and get these fabulous flavors. And the other thing about Okinawa that was fascinating is the idea of getting your sweet and your salty from whole foods. So salty from things like fish and seaweed and fermented soy sauce, which, by the way, most of the soy sauce that we get in this country is fake. It's not truly made in a fermented way. When it's truly fermented, you need to add very little salt to it. It actually makes its own salt and has this fabulous flavor. And this is sweet in Okinawa. This is what the kids fight over. It's basically emo, which is yam with maybe a little bit of brown sugar added to it. And it's considered delicious. They have emo ice cream. For goodness sakes, they have emo keychain charms, cell phone charms. I mean, they love emo. So a very different idea of sweet and salty. And finally, in Japan, who's the odd woman out here? Actually, I kind of look like I fit in a little bit. This is a family that hosted me and taught me about harahachibu. And for our Japanese speaker here, teach everybody what harahachibu means, if I'm saying it right.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not a Japanese.
Oh, you were nodding before at that.
I can read some Japanese.
Oh.
I don't know what that means.
Oh, okay. Oh, well. It means eat until you are 8 parts full. So this concept of diminishing what you eat by 20% right there, that's a diet plan, guys, okay? Just eat until you are happy but not full. Follow the messages from your stomach and not this drive to overeat. And that is really what they follow. So putting it all together, and I love this picture of me about to chop off my index finger, but I needed to prove to you guys that I do cook. I make all these foods, and I make them in less than a half hour each night. I have a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old who are really picky eaters, and I come home from my medical office and actually cook. And so I had to prove to you I have produce, I have a knife, I have a kitchen. And it's hopefully just to begin to, if not you, for you to inspire other people that you can make these changes, but in terms of bringing stuff into your diet, but you have to do it at home. It can't happen, other than the fabulous chefs at Google, it really can't happen by eating out consistently in restaurants, and a lot of these lessons. So native grains, meat in small amounts, non-meaty proteins, this idea of indigenous oils. I didn't talk about spices too much other than the spices in Copper Canyon, but all of these places had amazing healing spices, anti-inflammatory spices, fermented foods, and sugar and salt from whole foods. This was actually a feast in Peru right there where they had just killed a large animal for the feast. Local and in season is obviously a huge part of all this. Communal eating, having food traditions and feasts, the idea of harahachibu, or eat until you are 8 parts full, and finally this amazing concept of siga, or just slowing down, and how much that can do for your health. So one final story. I was walking through Crete trying to figure out what was the healing foods in terms of the Cretan diet, and this woman came riding up on her mule, and she took one look at me and she said, "You look terrible. Get on." And she hopped off her mule and put me on. This is a woman like in her 90s, And she took me a half mile down the road. So we have a lot to learn from these cultures that are doing so well. Thanks very much. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Are you familiar with the work of Dr. McDougall when it comes to the reduction of oils and animal fats in the diet? And did you notice any studies around veganism, specifically on a lower fat diet?
Any studies on what?
Veganism culturally and the lower fat content that Dr. McDougall is a proponent of with his studies.
I think there is so many ways to do this, guys. What is one of the most fascinating things about this? Does the Icelandic diet even vaguely like the Tarahumaran diet? No, they have these things in common that I mentioned. Certainly in terms of indigenous grains and the food cultures and so on. But I think we're always trying to find the silver bullet, you know. This week it's high fiber. There's some fabulous eat your 35 grams of fiber a day and that will save your life. You know, last month it was high protein. The month before it was match your menopause type or your blood type or whatever it is. You can't do that. It just, works for a little while, might work for a select group of people, might work for a couple of supermodels, or it might even work in a science experiment if you bring a bunch of people together and put them on a diet for 6 months. But what really works are looking at foods that have been together for hundreds of thousands of years and that work in a certain way. And I tell people, pick and choose. You know, if you have an issue with lots of colon cancer in your family, you might be especially attracted to what they're eating in West Africa, just to get started. Or if you're from Greece, you might be drawn to start eating more in a Cretan style. But these are ways of eating. It's kind of like an alphabet for us. You know, you don't just start making up your own language, or if you do, it doesn't last very long because no one else can understand you. And it really is the same with food. I'm not a big fan of the fusion cuisine. It's interesting for a night out, but there actually are magical interactions, and if you read the book, you'll find a lot of examples of them. So, there are some diets, I can certainly give you lots of examples, like the Tarahumaran, that get 70% of their calories from carbohydrates and have, very healthy diet and eat very little fat. But then I can go the other extreme and talk to you about the Inuit, who get like 90% of their calories from blubber and animal and also have a fabulous diet, but their animals are eating wonderful things. So they're getting vitamin C from the tundra moss that's going to the elk and then is going into their bodies. What does not work is our Western diet, the way it is set up right now. That is really clear, and it's making a lot of people really sick. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, just after following the program for 20 years, you kind of get paranoid when you hear alternate views of life.
Well, we all get paranoid when we get popped out of our real world view a little bit. But it's not to say you're wrong. It means that there's a lot of other rights. So someone else in this room is not doing what you're doing and is feeling pretty good right now. So, other questions? The Copper Canyon Voyager is going to...
Hi, when you were talking about oils before, I was wondering which of the ones in your list are ones that you use and are healthy. There's like almond, sunflower, grapeseed.
Yeah. I mainly cook with olive oil and lard. Those are the two things. I buy free-range bacon. I am not a vegetarian, I have to confess. I buy free-range bacon. I cook it up so that it doesn't, smoke or the lard doesn't get black. I just basically cook it very gently. I save the liquid lard in a jar next to my stove, and I use that in my cooking for flavor. It's amazing what a teaspoon will do to a pot of beans. And since it is free-range, it's actually rich in omega-3 fats. I showed you guys that. It's how they've used lard and chicken fat. My family's originally from the Mediterranean, Georgian area of Russia. Who knows? Somewhere up in we're kind of a mixture. But my great-great-grandmother used a lot of chicken fat in her cooking. Something called schmaltz in Yiddish. So those are olive oil and lard are the two I use. If I'm cooking West African food, I generally will use peanut oil, little bit, or I'll use palm fruit oil. I stay away from newfangled oils that you need lots of acetone and heavy equipment to make, like corn oil, sesame oil, canola oil is another example. I know there's a lot of industries out there pushing it, but it's actually it is from erucic acid, which is actually quite toxic to humans, but it's sort of reformulated into a more palatable form. And even though it has more omega-3s in it, it has a lot of omega-6 fats, which are inflammatory, and I don't use it.
I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about your background in terms of how you got into pursuing your hypotheses and your thesis. I mean,
I told the
about your
story
identity.
when I think you missed the first part, specifically about how I became interested in doing this. And in terms of watching people, actually, what really was one of the first things that got me interested in was I grew up overseas. I was a Peace Corps brat. My parents lived all over the world and never seemed to want to settle down. And so I was actually exposed to lots of different foods and lots of cultures early on. And then when I was in, actually even before medical school, I worked overseas for Save the Children and got very interested in indigenous diets even then. But then after medical school, when I went to medical school at Harvard and then came out to California, and I was working with, at San Francisco General Hospital with a lot of women who were second-generation Latina, who were developing very serious diabetes and heart disease, and started group medical visits with them. It was actually part of a research project I was doing. And what became incredibly obvious was that most of them had turned their backs on their traditional foods. And when they started to eat more traditionally, things really started to get better for them. And then I talk about the story at the beginning of this talk of one specific patient who kept on insisting that she got better when she went back to her traditional diet. And then my trip to the Amazon that kind of started me, you know, in full throttle on doing this. So. I don't know if it was mentioned in the introduction, I did a 2-year associate fellowship with Andrew Weil, you know, the guy with the big beard. So I've done a lot of formal studying of nutrition, if that's what you were asking, sort of what was. Yeah. But you know what? I felt like I had to throw all that stuff out when I started my travels. There's so much that I was taught as someone with a specialty in nutrition who's been teaching in the medical school for years that I feel was absolutely wrong. I mean, I'm much more cautious about warning people against saturated fats now. I think that it really is the kind of saturated fat that we're eating, you know, making sure, once again, that if you're eating meat, that it's high quality and not excessive amounts, and so on. Other questions? Well, thank you guys so much. It was lovely for you all to show up. And